Good morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Let's get right to it on a busy news morning. We begin, of course, with the new legal challenges for former President Donald Trump coming in the form of these new indictments handed down by a federal grand jury.
The grand jury returned a sweeping 45-page indictment yesterday. It was the culmination of a months-long investigation into Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. The former president now faces 4 charges: conspiracy to defraud the country, conspiracy to impede January 6 congressional proceedings, conspiracy against the right to vote, and obstruction of the electoral vote. This indictment marks the first time in history that a former president has been charged with trying to interfere with elections and undermine the democratic process. Special counsel Jack Smith had this to say just moments after the indictment was released to the public.
The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021 was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
The Trump campaign has responded to the indictment, calling the charges fake. It is the latest in a series of high-profile cases against the former president, whose mounting legal battles are overlapping with his 2024 election campaign. We, of course, have team coverage here, covering all aspects of this indictment, including Peter Nichols, Mark Murray, and Julie Sirkin. But first, let's begin our coverage with NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian and NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Ken, we'll start with you. This indictment, 45 pages long. Walk us through some of the biggest takeaways and what we learned from the indictment that maybe wasn't revealed during the January 6th committee hearings.
Good morning, Joe. It's a remarkable document, first of all, because it charges one defendant, Donald J. Trump, and names 6 unindicted co-conspirators, which was a bit of a surprise. But look, Jack Smith and his team lays out right away that it was not illegal for Donald Trump to claim fraud in the election, and he actually had a right to even lie about claims of fraud. But what they say is he crossed the line, he and others, when he acted on a scheme of what they call pervasive and destabilizing lies that was designed to subvert the lawful transfer of power. And as you said, there are 4 criminal charges here that describe 3 separate conspiracies. But what's interesting is what the former president is not charged with. He's not charged with inciting the January 6th riot. He's not charged with seditious conspiracy or insurrection-related charges that have been leveled at some of the violent rioters on January 6th. It's all about the campaign to try to delay the certification on January 6th, although the indictment does say that Mr. Trump exploited the violence on January 6th by making phone calls to senators and legislatures, even as the violence was erupting at the Capitol, urging them to slow and stop the certification process. That was one bit of new information in the indictment. There's also some new contemporaneous notes from Mike Pence, the vice president, that wasn't necessarily presented by the January 6th committee in those televised hearings. But I have to say, most of this indictment describes conduct that was laid out very compellingly by that January 6th committee. What this indictment does is put some flesh on the bones and describe a criminal conspiracy, guys.
Yeah, Danny, that's exactly what I want to ask you about. What do these specific charges, as well as any information that you can glean from this indictment, tell you about how extensive the investigation was?
I guess the answer is which investigation, because some of these facts alleged we saw as far back as the original Trump impeachment in connection with January 6th. And then last summer, we saw and watched and heard extensive hearings before Congress, before the January 6th committee, on exactly the same facts. Then they issued a report. So a lot of this since then has been publicly reported. So in essence, other than the facts that Ken pointed out, which require really scrutinizing this indictment, much of the facts in this indictment were known to the public. To the public at large, it was readily available. The real question wasn't so much those alleged facts, but whether or not the special counsel believed those facts fit into federal criminal statutes. And the answer now appears to be that he obviously does. And keep in mind, there were other charges, other potential statutes that were thrown around, like insurrection, that were not charged. And I think that was probably the prudent course for Jack Smith. It is really easy for former prosecutors and people like me to come into a studio and say they could charge the insurrection statute. But it's a totally different thing for a prosecutor to stake his career on going up against the most difficult, most challenging criminal defendant in the history of American law and prove those charges beyond a reasonable doubt. This represents a more, I guess I would say, reasonable approach to getting an indictment. That plus naming unindicted co-conspirators, but leaving them actually out of the indictment, all designed to streamline this and get to the target, who is Donald Trump.
Let's talk more about that, Ken. As you mentioned, the indictment lists 6 unnamed, unindicted alleged co-conspirators. NBC News believes it has, though, uncovered most of their identities based on past reporting of actions that are described in the indictments. So who do we think they are?
I'm picking up my phone so I can read my notes here. So co-conspirator number 1, Rudy Giuliani, we believe. Number 2, John Eastman. Number 3, Sidney Powell. Number 4, Jeff Clark. And number 5, Kenneth Chesebro. I think we're unclear on number 6. So everybody knows who Rudy Giuliani is. He was President Trump's lawyer. He was integrally involved in advancing claims of fraud in the election. And in fact, his license to practice law has been suspended in both New York and D.C. because the bars there concluded that he made unsupported claims in court, claims of fraud that just didn't stand up. So that's Giuliani. John Eastman was one of the architects of what we call the fake electors plan, the plan to present alternative slates of electors in 7 contested states. He was also advising former President Trump that Vice President Mike Pence had the authority to stop the certification on January 6th, which Pence and other legal experts said was false. Jeff Clark was a lower-level Justice Department official who was trying to get the Justice Department to declare that there was fraud in the election in perhaps the most dangerous chapter of this whole plot. He wanted the Justice Department to send out a letter to various states saying, we've identified fraud. Senior DOJ officials, Trump appointees, stopped that. But nonetheless, Jack Smith has alleged that as part of the criminal conspiracy. And Kenneth Chesebro was another lawyer who was considered the architect and the father of the fake electors plan. Again, these people are unnamed. This is based on our reporting. And it's interesting that they were not charged. And as Danny says, it suggests that the special counsel wants to move this case forward as quickly as possible.
All right, Ken and Danny, thank you both.
And now let's bring in NBC News congressional correspondent Julie Sirkin for more. Hey, Julie, good morning. So House Republicans have continued to support the former president despite his legal trouble. They've also called out the Biden administration on this. Just walk us through that. What are you hearing this time from House leaders as the former president now has this 3rd indictment?
Yeah, good morning, Savannah and Joe. Well, what we're hearing is what you might expect, and similar to what we've heard before when those other 2 indictments came down, particularly when it comes to the former president's allies who are standing in his corner, like you've said, or using this moment to talk about a, quote, 2-tier system of justice. For example, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy tweeting yesterday that this is an attempt by the DOJ to, quote, distract from Hunter Biden revelations into the investigation and whatever is going on with the current president's son, something House Republicans are certainly using their political capital to look into. Just Monday, they actually heard from a Hunter Biden family associate, Devin Archer, who testified before Congress. A lot of Republicans are saying the timing of the former president's indictment here has something to do with that. Others, like, for example, Matt Gaetz, suggesting to defund special counsel Jack Smith's office entirely. And we've heard this before, but it's something that's going to keep coming up and something that will be interesting to watch as we get closer to September and that government funding fight that Speaker McCarthy is very much in the center of.
And Julie, now let's talk about the other side of this. What are you hearing from Democrats?
Yeah, well, reminder, Congress is out of session. They're all in a lengthy recess. So everything we're hearing from them comes in the form of statements and tweets. And so we heard from Leader Schumer and Leader Jeffries, the 2 Democratic leaders of the House and the Senate, coming out with a joint statement saying that this indictment concerning the election interference claims in January 6th is, quote, the most serious and most consequential so far. Likewise, we heard from Democrats on the January 6th Select Committee who spent a year and a half investigating the former president's conduct on that day and before that day, like Danny and Ken pointed out, which is why the public was aware of much of what is in this indictment from Jack Smith, the special counsel. Democrats are saying that this is something that needs to follow the process of the law. They are saying that no one can interfere in the investigation into this. Of course, the former president is innocent until proven guilty. But remember, Democrats, Republicans were all in the building on January 6th. So this case is slightly different than the other 2 indictments.
All right, Julie Sirkin, thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray so we can discuss the indictment's impact on the 2024 race. Mark, good morning. So as we know, former Vice President Mike Pence also running for the Republican nomination against Trump. We know he has an integral part of the events on January 6th. He recently called Trump's actions on that day reckless, but said he wasn't convinced yet that they were crimes. What is he now saying about this new indictment?
Joe, he released a statement last night, a really harsh one, saying that any person who puts themselves above the Constitution does not deserve to be president. And that actually stands in sharp contrast to the reactions we ended up getting from other Republican presidential hopefuls like Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, who complained more about the Justice Department, the FBI, than they did about Donald Trump's actions. So Mike Pence with a very tough statement aimed at the person that he once served under.
Trump's legal troubles have not weakened his support, we know so far, with Republican voters. Where does his lead over his rivals stand right now? Do we have any idea how this might impact that?
Yeah, Joe, he has a commanding lead in this Republican race. According to a New York Times Siena poll that was conducted before yesterday's charges, Donald Trump had a 37-point lead over Ron DeSantis and the rest of the Republican field. That's consistent with almost all the other polling. What we have seen after the first criminal indictment that Donald Trump ended up receiving back in April, and then after the one in June, his standing has only increased over his rivals. But it remains to be seen. We have not had any polling that has been conducted after yesterday's indictment. And Joe, we just have to wait and see about reactions that Republican voters might have to this latest indictment.
You know, we know Trump has continued to campaign as these investigations into his conduct move forward. Real quickly, how much of a talking point has this become during his speeches and his fundraising pitches?
Yeah, all the multiple indictments about him have actually become big talking points. And just yesterday, the Trump campaign ended up releasing an ad that almost seemed to be willing to pre-butt the charges that they knew they were coming against them. And they actually ended up saying that this was all because of President Biden's Justice Department, that Donald Trump is leading in the polls. And this is all an effort to knock President Biden's chief rival down. Of course, you know, it is important to note that the special counsel was appointed precisely to have some type of buffer between the politics and President Biden's administration's role in this investigation.
All right, Mark, thank you so much.
Let's now bring in NBC News senior White House reporter Peter Nichols for more reaction from Washington. And I said White House correspondent, but when I say reaction, we've seen a typically muted reaction from the White House, from both the Biden campaign as well. Tell us about that.
Well, the White House has been reluctant to weigh in. Donald Trump has claimed that this is a case of election interference. The Justice Department has been weaponized by Joe Biden. And the White House doesn't want to play into that. So anything that they say is likely to be exploited by Donald Trump. And so they've been very quiet. And in doing so, they're trying to make another point that Trump brings chaos, Trump brings drama, Biden represents stability. And the thought is that after 4 years of Donald Trump, voters rejected his style of governing. Biden offers a more stable kind of model of how to manage the White House, how to run a presidency, and they think that Trump's troubles and these indictments only further Biden's argument, advance Biden's argument that he's the safer choice.
So walk us through how exactly, because I think this is an important part of this, that the Biden administration is trying to separate itself from the former president, as well as these investigations, the Justice Department, all this that he's facing.
Well, the silence you're hearing from the White House is one way they're trying to separate themselves. They don't want to put their thumb on the scale. There's a rule in politics: when your opponent is struggling, step back, let it happen. You know, don't necessarily do anything to impede that. So I think that's what we're seeing now, is the White House is just letting Donald Trump stew in his own juices here, and they're going about their business. You know, they're talking about infrastructure spending. They're talking about reduced inflation. They're talking about lower gas prices, things that affect American pocketbooks in a real way. And they think that that is a winning contrast that they can draw with Donald Trump that's effective for them.
Peter, thank you so much for your reporting this morning.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.